Today, the European Championship is one of football's biggest prizes. Spain, Germany, Italy, every major nation dreams of lifting the trophy. But the very first European champions weren't any of them. They were the Soviet Union. Yet few people remember it. Awaiting the Soviets in the final was Yugoslavia, the communist state that had defied Stalin and humiliated Soviet football just 8 years earlier. Their meeting in Paris was more than a football match. It was the culmination of a rivalry shaped by politics, ideology, and 8 years of unfinished business. And then there was the infamous quarter-final that was never played. This is the oft-forgotten story of Euro 1960, where football, diplomacy, and the Cold War collided, and where, after decades of producing some of the world's greatest teams, Eastern European football finally claimed its first major senior international title. Although the World Cup had been in place for 3 decades, in the 1950s the one glaring omission in the international game was a European Championship. As astonishing as it might seem today, UEFA's first General Secretary, Henry Delaunay, had a difficult time convincing most of the continent's footballing authorities to help make it a reality. The World Cup was by now well established and the ultimate prize, and the international game was taken up in the World Cup's intermittent years by World Cup qualifying, many friendlies which drew large crowds, and established regional championships, some of which had already been played for decades, including the Central European International Cup, the British Home Championship, the Balkan Cup, the Nordic Championship, and the Mediterranean Cup. West Germany, England, Italy, Belgium and the Netherlands all opted out, but UEFA managed to convince 17 teams to enter the inaugural European Nations Cup. And while many of Western Europe's footballing elite declined to participate, Eastern Europe embraced the competition. Despite producing some of the greatest football teams in history and winning gold at the Olympics, no Eastern European nation had ever won a major senior international championship. The inaugural European Championships offered a chance to finally change that. Eastern European football had been very much the equal of South American and Western European football for decades, and at times its superior. Regardless of the result of the 1954 final, there was little question that Hungary's mighty Magyars had been the best international team in the world throughout most of the 1950s, setting records that still stand to this day. Czechoslovakia were the 1934 World Cup runners-up, a feat that they would repeat in 1962, and Hungary had reached the final as well in 1938 and 1954. In 1930, Yugoslavia were the only European team to reach the semi-finals, which they repeated again in 1962. And the Olympic golds throughout the new decade were taken by Hungary in 1952, the Soviet Union in 1956, and Yugoslavia in 1960. After the Second World War had ended, Dynamo Moscow had toured the UK, playing the top sides in each region under an atmosphere that George Orwell described as war minus the shooting, and astonishing the British audience by remaining unbeaten, defeating Arsenal 4-3 and Cardiff City 10-1, and drawing 3-3 against Chelsea in front of a crowd of over 75,000 and 2-2 against Rangers. By the mid-50s, though, the USSR, previously left out of the equation in international football, had gradually joined the other 3 Eastern European powerhouses of football. The USSR only entered its first major international tournament in 1952 at the Helsinki Olympics, and the tournament helped to convince Soviet leaders to put the power of the Soviet state behind football. In just another 4 years, they walked away with the gold in 1956, and 2 years later they reached the quarterfinals of their first World Cup, losing out only to the hosts. And throughout this time, they had developed their own golden generation of players, including Lev Yashin, the only goalkeeper, even to this day, to win the Ballon d'Or, and still regarded by many as the greatest goalkeeper of all time. The first European Championships, named the European Nations Cup, would take place in home and away matches stretched out periodically from September 1958 to May 1960, starting with the last 16 and then the quarter-finals, with the final 4 teams progressing to the semi-finals and final to be played in July 1960. As the tournament was so new, it was decided that only the final 4 matches would be played in a host country, and the host would be chosen from one of the 4 semi-finalists after they had been determined. As 17 nations had agreed to play, Czechoslovakia defeated Ireland in a preliminary game to bring the number to 16, and they were joined by Hungary, Denmark, Greece, Turkey, Austria, Bulgaria, Portugal, Spain, the USSR, France, Romania, Norway, East Germany, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Denmark. The USSR's first match was somewhat of a passing of the torch as they played Hungary in Moscow in front of a crowd of 100,000. Although Hungary had been unbeatable earlier in the decade and people still expected them to pick up a World Cup or now this new European trophy, the USSR went 3-0 ahead within the first 32 minutes and ended up winning 3-1. A year later, the second leg was played in Budapest, with the USSR managing to win again, this time 1-0 from a goal by Voinov. The lineup for the quarter-finals took months to be confirmed, with each game of the first round being spaced out roughly a month or so from the adjacent ones, but eventually the quarter-finals were confirmed, with France taking on Austria, Portugal against Yugoslavia, and Romania against Czechoslovakia. And the USSR, in the most interesting of all the ties, though not for the reasons one might expect, were to play Spain. But they didn't. In 1960, 21 years after the end of the Spanish Civil War, General Franco's Spain and the Soviet Union had no diplomatic relations whatsoever, and it had been that way since the war had ended, mainly from general ideological differences and in large part due to Soviet military supplies to the Republican side during the war. As the quarter-finals were still being played in 2 matches, both home and away, the situation put Franco in an awkward position with his own diplomatic position. First, allowing the Spanish team to travel to Moscow and the Soviets to Madrid would have required beginning some kind of diplomatic relationship, if only for the purpose of international sport. And second, regardless of the results, such a match would be an opportunity for Cold War propaganda, one that he himself could take advantage of, but one that could backfire if the Soviets won. UEFA then faced a dilemma. Although the Soviets were happy to go ahead with the fixture, Franco refused to let the Spanish team enter the Soviet Union, and likewise the Soviet team to enter Spain. Instead, the Spanish football authorities proposed playing the ties at neutral venues. The Soviet authorities, though, argued that whatever the political situation, it shouldn't interfere with the tournament, and they had qualified under the rules that the first 2 rounds would be played over 2 games on a home and away basis. As the impasse couldn't be broken, the Soviet Union progressed without kicking a ball in the quarter-finals, as UEFA decided that the rules required a home and away tie, and as such, the Spanish had forfeited. Looking back all these years later, the question remains, did the Soviet Union receive the luckiest break in football history? With 4 semi-finalists confirmed, France was chosen to host the final 4 matches played over 5 days. In the July heat, both semi-finals went the way of Eastern Europe, with the Soviet Union defeating Czechoslovakia 3-0, while Yugoslavia survived a 9-goal thriller against hosts France, edging them out 5-4, coming back from 4-2 down, ensuring that the inaugural European champions would come from behind the Iron Curtain, and Eastern Europe, 3-time runners-up at the World Cup, would finally lift a major trophy outside the Olympics. Although the final wasn't capitalism against communism, it was hardly free of politics. The Soviet Union and Yugoslavia had spent more than a decade as uneasy rivals within the communist world. In 1948, Tito had become the only communist leader to openly defy Stalin, creating a deep rift that would shape relations between the 2 countries for years to come. Although relations had improved following Stalin's death, the rivalry had already spilled onto the football pitch. At the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia produced one of the most extraordinary matches in international football history. Trailing 5-1, the Soviets staged a remarkable comeback to draw 5-5 before losing the replay 3-1 2 days later. Both Tito and Stalin sent personal messages to the players before the match, and afterwards, as most of the Soviet players played for CDSA Moscow, the Soviet authorities withdrew the club from the Soviet Championship and dissolved it. To fuel the tension, although the Soviets were newcomers to big international tournaments, there were few nations like Yugoslavia that had been so consistently successful without lifting one of football's biggest trophies. Semi-finalists in the first World Cup, which they would be again in '62, and runners-up in 3 consecutive Olympic finals, in '48, '52 and '56. And in 1956, their loss in the Olympic final was to the USSR, who were only competed in their second Olympics and had yet to play in a World Cup. At 8:30 on the 10th of July 1960, the first European Championship final took place in rainy conditions at the French National Stadium. Partly as many people were still unsure about the new tournament, and partly because local interest in the final waned a little after the hosts had been knocked out, especially from losing a 2-goal lead, a crowd of just under 18,000 watched the making of history, only about 40% of the stadium's capacity. In contrast, over 127,000 had watched the 1960 European Cup final between Real Madrid and Eintracht Frankfurt at Hampden Park just 2 months earlier. To add more to the occasion, Yugoslavia's regular goalkeeper Sosic, who had starred in their semi-final just 4 days earlier, was ruled out by an eye problem, forcing Vidinic into the starting lineup. Although football matches are won by teams, this one would largely be decided by the man between the posts. Above all, Lev Yashin produced one of the finest goalkeeping displays of the decade. Both teams struggled with the wet pitch from the outset, but Yugoslavia adapted better, pressing into the Soviet penalty area early on and controlling much of the first half, forcing Yashin into brilliant goalkeeping to keep the score at 0-0. But the Soviets couldn't withstand the constant attacks, and with only minutes before half-time, Jurkovic crossed the ball into the area, allowing Galic to score in his 10th consecutive international, equaling the world record. After the break, Yugoslavia continued in the same manner, and only a succession of brilliant saves from Yashin prevented them from putting the final beyond the Soviet Union. But the USSR themselves, after the break, began to play with a greater sense of urgency, and not long after the start of the second half, Valentin Bubukin took a long shot which Vidinic stopped but couldn't hold, providing Slava Mitrovica the chance to equalise. As the Soviet Red Star newspaper reported 2 days after the game, the tension of the match, the high tempo and the wet pitch all took their toll on the players. Both teams had chances to score, but the score remained unchanged. After 90 minutes elapsed, the deadlock would have to be broken by extra time. And if 30 additional minutes couldn't do it, then it would have to be a coin toss. Not metaphorically, but literally. As extra time wore on, both sides, already exhausted, began to tire. But then came the first defining moment. Yugoslavia finally broke through and a dangerous ball skidded across the face of the Soviet goal. Had Dražen Jurkovic's foot been a few inches closer, the match may well have been over, but it passed a split second or two beyond his outstretched boot. With 7 minutes to play before a captain would have to choose heads or tails, the left winger Mikhail Meski managed to cross the ball into the Yugoslav box, and this time Viktor Ponedeljnik, the only Soviet player from SKA Rostov-on-Don, managed to head the ball into the net. It was just as decisive as Jurkovic's earlier miss, and the score remained at 2-1 until the final whistle. As Ponedeljnik would say afterwards, those kind of goals are a climax in a player's sporting life. As the final whistle echoed around the Parc des Princes, Yashin had been beaten only once despite intervening 69 times. Although many people had been skeptical about the new tournament, the world-class performance by the Yugoslavs and Soviets throughout the tournament, and especially to produce a nail-biting final, helped to deem the tournament not only a success, but a necessity for the continent. Over the next 4 tournaments, Eastern European teams continued to make the tournament their own, with the Soviets reaching the 64 and 72 final, and Yugoslavia again reaching the final in 68. But it was in 76 when Czechoslovakia finally avenged their 2 World Cup final losses by beating West Germany on penalties to become the champions of Europe. The Soviet Union would never again stand alone as European champions, but for one summer in 1960, they achieved something no Eastern European nation had ever done before.